All right, we're going to talk to our friend Wilson Alexander from The Advocate coming up here in a couple of minutes. We will talk to and recap the spring football storylines with Wilson as he is set to join us here in a couple of minutes. Morgan Wallen was set to join the Ole Miss crowd last night. I had no idea who Morgan Wallen was, embarrassingly enough.
Yeah, you asked me if he was black this morning.
That
was amazing.
I did.
Like, he's like
I knew these
the whitest person ever.
Well, these new age country stars.
Yeah, you never know.
I
think it's
so what
hilarious.
happened? He canceled? So
he canceled. He said he lost his voice, so everybody saw him at the library the night before till like 4 a.m. or something.
Wow.
Yeah, so he lost his voice. And David and his crew were up there this weekend, and they said everybody was like banking on that Sunday show because the other concert started Saturday when the game was still going on. So all these rednecks were going to the Sunday show, and now they got their feelings hurt.
Oxford never lost a party.
Mm-hmm. They did Sunday.
Lost all their baseball games this weekend.
They did. They lost a lot of parties.
In true Ole Miss fashion.
Sad little beer shower they threw. I saw the one sad little beer shower. There was no one at that game yesterday.
Huge LSU fan this weekend, you, huh?
I know, I was. Oh, my God, yes. Are you kidding?
How'd Mississippi State do?
We lost 2 to Auburn. Okay. So we didn't get swept.
Oof, golly. Is
we
that where
won
you're at
one.
now?
Huh?
That's where it's at now?
It's bad, yeah. It's bad. I mean, it's not as terrible as Ole Miss, but it's bad.
Yeah.
Could be worse.
I guess it's
as long as Ole Miss is worse, though, I'm all good.
All right, Wilson Alexander, who covers LSU football. He covers LSU sports for The Advocate. Remember, you can read his work on Twitter, and easy to find him there, as we always are encouraging you. I'm trying to make sure I read it correctly here. Wilson Alexander is there at WH Alexander _ over at The Advocate covering LSU football. Still has great hair. Another spring later, waking up with us here on this Monday morning. Wilson, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Jordy. It's funny that you talk about my Twitter because I thought about changing the handle now that blue check marks don't matter at all. Because people always think that it has something to do with whales. They don't usually get the H like you did. So good job.
Thank you. I knew that's why I had to get to it because I knew I always forget a letter. I didn't know if it was K or
Well,
H.
Alexander.
All right, so lots to get to this spring. There were some guys out on defense. My biggest takeaways were on the defensive side, Wilson. We'll get to the offense and the quarterbacks and all of what's happening there. What did you take away from the defense and covering them this spring and watching them play on Saturday?
A couple of things, starting with the defensive front. That's a group that's going to be versatile. They can line up in a bunch of different sort of subtle alignments that may not mean a whole lot to the casual fan, but the way that Mekhi Wingo can split out to defensive end and Jacobian Guillory, even though he's a nose guard, he can split out over, a 4-eye technique, which is kind of over the guard. And that's not something that he did earlier in his career. They're so deep there in the front. And then, just included in the front really at linebacker, I think there's a lot to like there with, there's a lot made about the move to Harold Perkins inside. But that seems like it's going to be a natural fit for him. He's still rushing the passer, either right up the middle as a blitzer off of stunts or, even coming off the edge at times. That's where he's worked on third down all spring. And you still got Greg Penn there. A lot to like out of Whit Weeks, that big interception return Saturday. So LSU feels better about the depth because of guys like him. May not need like a transfer linebacker like it thought it was going to, but there's still plenty of questions in the secondary. And that's really going to be a big piece of how far this LSU team ends up going. Is what happens at cornerback, how does that group shake out? And then also in the back end, can they stay healthy with Greg Brooks and Major Burns? Because if not, then there's just not a lot of guys there.
I thought the defensive back that nobody was talking about going into spring or a lot during spring that was really, I thought, shining on Saturday was LaTerrence Welsh, one of the only returners in the defensive backfield. What kind of move do you expect him to make here before fall?
He's definitely in the mix, and it's funny that none of us were really, like you said, talking about him a whole lot, but Greg Brooks did. When he spoke with the media, the only cornerback he mentioned was he thought that LaTerrence Welch had a really good spring to that point, and that was pretty early on. He continued to get some work. He was mostly with the second team during our little media viewing periods, but we saw him with the first team at times, and he's long, and he showed his coverage ability there in the spring game with those 2 pass breakups. I mean, he was right on the guy. And did a great job getting his head turned around to bat the ball away. This is a cornerback competition that is far from settled. We saw Isaiah Alexander, the Southeastern transfer, out there. We saw J.K. Johnson out there. We saw Denver Harris get a little bit of run with the ones as well. And Deuce Chestnut's going to be firmly in that mix as such an experienced transfer from Syracuse. But LaTerrence Welch is right in it too. And even if he is more of a rotational player, that's a step up from where he was as a freshman who mainly played special teams. So it's an encouraging sign in his development.
I thought a key addition to this team is Omar Spates in the offseason, a transfer from Oregon State. You can see that him and Perkins will be have good chemistry playing alongside one another. At least it seemed that way watching them play on Saturday.
He might be the biggest transfer. I don't think it would be a stretch to say out of everybody that LSU got, because especially once DeMario Tolan hit the portal, they needed an inside linebacker. And Spates is one who's experienced. He's versatile. You saw his tape at Oregon State. He could split out and cover wide receivers over the slot. He made good tackles in space, and we saw some of that again here. And so it gives LSU a really interesting, sort of trio there as the starters with Spates, Harold Perkins, and Greg Penn. And Matt House is going to be able to sort of move them around in a lot of, I think, interesting ways. Greg's more of a traditional sort of inside the box linebacker, and Spates can be too, but with Harold and everything that he can do and all the sort of different things that Spates can do as well, because he's so rangy, it really gives LSU a solid trio there at linebacker. And Spates is experienced. He's already been described as sort of a leader defensively because of how much college football he's played, and he's also sort of a model to that room, Matt House said, because he has had so much experience and knows what he's doing. And physically, he just looks like he's there. This is going to be a huge transfer for LSU.
Real quick, more on Perkins at linebacker. You spoke as if it was definitive, like he'll be at middle the entire season. Or is this just an experiment in teaching him more of how to play and teaching him to be a better football player, or is this a move we expect to be definitive?
This is more definitive from what I understand. He spent the LSU, the long-term plan with him was for him to play inside linebacker. Specifically, he's been at will linebacker, which is the weak side of those inside linebackers. He's not necessarily just like the Mike, right in the middle there, but it is something that LSU always wanted to do with him once he got here. And last year, he was playing out on the edge because that was what he could handle at the time. Playing inside linebacker, you have to know all those run fits. And there's a lot more responsibilities and calls that have to be made. Playing him off the edge allowed him to be just fast and use his athleticism and chase down quarterbacks. But they wanted him to maybe, sort of take that, evolve into that next, sort of phase of his development or whatever, be as a linebacker. And that's what we're seeing there on Saturday, and what we've heard about all spring is that he's going to be playing inside. And that's the expectation. I'd be surprised if he just moved back solely to outside linebacker, because that would sort of be a walk back in that development for him. And so, we saw him play well inside this spring, and that's where he's expected to continue to be. As I mentioned, he'll still be with the jack linebackers on third downs and be a pass rusher in those sorts of situations. One of the reasons that Brian Kelly is so excited about the return of Mason Smith is because of the way he opens up things for Harold as a pass rusher. So it's not like he's not going to be doing that, but he's going to get a lot of work, particularly on first and second down on the inside.
Defensive line, I was really impressed with the newcomers in Swinson and is it Paris Sneed's Shad, who has come in here defensively and stepped in for a down unit here during the spring. You're going to get the additions of Mason Smith and Mekhi Wingo and even Jordan Jefferson come fall, but I thought that defensive line was pretty promising on Saturday.
It was. Braden Swinson is still, I think, probably the second team jack linebacker behind Ovie Agofu, but he'd done some promising things at Oregon, and if LSU can continue to draw that out of him, then you like what you got. He made a disruptive play in the backfield, and LSU may end up maybe he's the guy who can fit into a rotation there. And then Paris Shand, what's interesting about him is that he's only listed at 267 pounds, but he's been playing defensive tackle, which is a lot lighter than what you would maybe expect. But it continues to speak to sort of what LSU may be able to do with this defensive front, which is move guys around a good bit, because that size would project maybe more as a defensive end. But he was playing first-team tackle all spring with those other guys out. And so that's somebody else that LSU feels good about. and as a depth piece, because like you said, you're going to have those starters, be Mekhi Wingo for sure, Mason Smith, as long as he continues to progress in his knee as he is doing so and is expected to do. And then, Jacoby Guillory looked good all spring too, and Paris fits into that. And then Jordan Jefferson. Now all of a sudden, last year, we're talking about really two guys at defensive tackle with Jacqueline Roy and Mekhi Wingo. And Jacobian rotated some, but it really wasn't a lot. I mean, Jacobian and Mekhi played more snaps than any defensive tackle duo in all of college football. Wow. And now LSU can run 5-6 deep.
One more on defense. If Harold Perkins is not the weak side linebacker on this team, who is projected to start there?
Well, then it would probably be, if they just were to run two inside linebackers, it would be, Greg Penn and Omar Spates. Once you get into the sort of the weak side and all that kind of thing, it gets sort of down into the weeds of, what scheme and formation they're using. When they use sort of like a base 3-3-5 or 4-2-5, depending on how you want to define it exactly, they use those two inside linebackers, so it would be Greg and Omar. That's the other thing, though. They don't have a lot of depth at linebacker, so, it would probably be the Weeks brothers, whichever one really takes this next step in fall camp. Probably West as the more experienced player. He would be the other one who would step up.
Wilson, I can't imagine that there's a more talented quarterback room in the league, and LSU might have as good a quarterback room as there is in the country. What did you take of that position during the last couple of weeks and what you saw from Saturday?
There's a lot to feel confident about in that quarterback room. What struck me was the fact that in last year's spring game, Jaden Daniels was running all over the place. That's what he sort of knew how to do at the time. He was still getting used to things. And then on Saturday, we saw him sitting back in the pocket, taking his checkdowns when they were available to him, going through progression reads. That first throw to Kyron Lacey, that was really the highlight of the spring game because of the catch that Lacey made. You saw Daniels working entirely left to right. Kyron Lacey was not his first read on that play. And he was able, because he understands his offense so much better now, to get through to that spot, find him open. And even though the throw maybe wasn't perfect, let his wide receiver go make a play. And he was efficient. And then Garrett Nussmeier was just what we've seen out of him in the postseason. Throwing 2 touchdowns, showing off his arm, that 51-yard bomb to Brian Thomas when he did get in with the first team. And he was playing a lot with the twos. So, as Brian Kelly said, you could even make the argument that he was better at times than Jaden was. And so there's so much to feel confident about in this group. You can tell why LSU constantly says we have 2 quarterbacks who we feel good about, because they both looked really sharp in the spring game. And it's all a spring game, as all of this is, so you don't maybe want to put too much into it. But it's good to see when they go out and you play the way that you would expect them to.
Do you expect they keep both, right? I mean, obviously it would be Nussmeier, but I mean, you don't expect any movement, right?
No, I don't. I don't expect any changes. Garrett is on LSU isn't expected to still be here, and he's certainly had chances to leave during the first portal window. He did not, and it would be a surprise if at this point he were to transfer. Anything can happen in college football, always at this point, in this era, the transfer portal and everything. But it would be a surprise if he were to leave.
I was impressed with the offensive line. I know that they were down scholarship players. They had to, bring some guys from the other side of the ball to really even get through spring. But now, Wilson, I look up and there's going to be a drop off here of some very talented offensive linemen, whether it's the 4 true freshmen coming in or it's a guy like Mason Lunsford coming from Maryland. I know that they extended another offer last week in the transfer portal. What do you expect this offensive line to look like come fall?
Well, the first team is, if it stays the same, it's in good shape anyway. But there could be some movement. Brad Davis likes to tinker and he likes to cross train. And then like you say, bringing in a guy like Mason Lunsford, who has 23 career starts, a lot of them at left guard. Can he push for time, or does he end up being, even if it's just a depth piece, it's a good depth piece to have? So Lance Hurd, the 5-star, the one who told Brian Kelly on his recruiting visit that he wants to play left tackle, and Brian Kelly said, well, we have Will Campbell, and Lance said, I still want to play left tackle. He's confident, and he feels like he can push right away, and he's the kind of guy who maybe he can. And if he can, and he ends up maybe getting a job at right tackle, per se, instead of left, Emory Jones maybe moves inside, and then you're shuffling guys around. So we're going to maybe see some of that in the preseason, at least like working on those different kinds of combinations, just for Brad Davis and LSU to kind of see what it has at offensive line. But they bringing back 5 guys with starting experience, and so that it could end up being the same group that we kind of saw in the year last year, just with Garrett Dellinger sliding in instead of Anthony Bradford. And then of course there's going to be a big battle at center. Marlon Martinez, thought about transferring, ended up staying. And now he's going to be right in the mix there competing for a role with Charles Turner once he's back from his knee injury.
Wide receivers always been a very talented group on this team. No Aaron Anderson out there on Saturday. Kyron Lacey looked like he was trying to make his move to be in the top 3 as far as the rotation goes. Landon Ibieta is another name that a lot of people learned about on Saturday. What do you make of this group, and what's the potential here of what they could provide this offense?
Kyron is a name that we heard about all spring. Mike Denbrock backed that up when he said, "I love what Kyron's been doing," in his press conference a couple weeks ago. But he's just somebody who constantly sort of just heard good things about Kyron. And in his second year at LSU, after transferring, over from the Raging Cajuns, he really seemed to make a leap. And this is the talented wide receiver room, but he has emerged as an option, and somebody who is going to push for that starting job. Come preseason camp and really be in the mix there. And then, Brian Thomas and Malik Neighbors are certainly going to be starters. But then once Aaron Anderson comes back, that's 4 guys competing for those spots. And there's a lot to like there. But LSU's going to rotate. And there's even more like that you said that we've mentioned. I mean, yeah. Kyle Parker had a good spring. Jaylen Brown had a pretty good spring. They're still learning quite a lot, but they've kind of gotten that under their belts a little bit. They made some impressive contested catches. Kyle Parker could be involved as a returner as well. And yeah, Landon Ibieta, that was such a great moment to see, because that's a guy who, signs with Brian Kelly and this staff kind of late in the process. I guess, one sort of cycle ago, and then misses almost his entire freshman year, doesn't get to play at all, never really dressed out until the bowl game. He makes a catch in the bowl game. It's his first catch after missing all that time. And then now in the spring game gets to show a little bit of what he can do once he gets the ball in his hands, and get in some space and make guys miss and really show some speed that was impressive. And that's not even to get to someone like Chris Hilton, who's really fast, has been working outside and feels like he's healthy now. And so this is a talented room that will be one of the best in the SEC, if not the most talented group. And, we got to let it kind of play out on the field, but there's so much to like about this receiver room.
What's the concern level around kicker?
Well, it did not look good in the spring game, as everybody saw. I don't know how high the level of concern is, because we don't know what they did, the rest of the spring and what LSU saw from them in practice. But and Damian Ramos, even though he missed a couple of kicks, he did go 10 of 14, last season, as a starter in real games, made that clutch 47-yarder against Florida. But it doesn't to see both guys shaky was a little bit worrisome. I think the main takeaway, though, at this point, because it is just a spring game, probably the main takeaway is just that it's not settled at who's going to be the starter there. Yeah. Brian Kelly said as much that competition is ongoing. It's going to go into the preseason, and hopefully for LSU's sake, once they actually real games are coming around, those guys are making those kicks. Because if special teams is another problem in any area this season, that's not going to be good. And LSU fans are just going to absolutely, I think, lose their minds if there's something else wrong with special teams.
Any expectation on a name or a projected date to name Jamar Cain's replacement at defensive line coach?
I don't have a firm name at this point. An expected date would probably be within the next week to 10 days, maybe. We heard it was about 2 weeks ago that Brian Kelly said that to expect something in 3 weeks. Okay, so that would be maybe by the end of this weekend. Does that though end up coming up with everything going on in the NFL draft? I'm not sure. Everybody around LSU has said that he was sort of taking his time with this, and that it was going to be something that he really hit hard after spring football ended. Now that is over, he's on the road a little bit recruiting, and he can get out and see candidates face to face and really do some interviews. And so I think that he's now going to really be ramping up this process, and that's kind of where that stands at this point.
Wilson, I know it's not your specialty, but I know you're around the program this weekend. Recruiting looked like it was in full swing. especially with people like Joe Burrow and Angel Reese and Jamar Chase hanging around. Did you see anything that jumped out to you from a recruiting standpoint, just kind of being down in the mix?
Well, the 5-star pass rusher Colin Simmons, for him to be on campus, that seemed significant in particular. It was great for LSU from a recruiting standpoint to have Burrow, and also just from a broader philosophical sort of thing. I know there was sort of a lot made of the field paint, but the path is sort of one of their big recruiting sort of slogan, and they were pushing that and using that in the spring game to try to recruit. And obviously already picked up the commitment from Deshaun McBride. That wasn't just a result of the recruiting this weekend, but sort of a nice feather in their cap there to cap what was had a weekend that had so many recruits on campus. And so LSU's up now to 13 commits already in this class. That's the most in the country, I think. Last time I checked, it was, and I think it probably still is. And expect them now to kind of be a little bit more selective, from what I've been told, on the recruiting front as they finish up this class, because you can still sign this year as many as you want, but that's already getting close to probably about half of what they would end up signing. They're not going to end up signing 45 kind of people. So to already have 13 is this class is getting rounded out pretty quickly.
Whalesander _ at Whalesander _ Wilson Alexander, who joins us and breaks down LSU. He's a fantastic follow. He's a great read. If you like LSU, he's a must follow to keep up with what's going on with LSU and LSU football. Wilson, as always, thank you, man. Have a great week.
Thanks for having me, Jordy. You too.
All right, man. There he is, Wilson Alexander, checking in this morning. As always, we're brought to you by RMB Builders. Make sure and check out RMB as far as it goes online, rmb-builders.com. As we enjoy the second hour here, make sure and hit that like button, share button, comment button. We've talked LSU baseball. Thanks to Doug Thompson for stopping by as Dougie wrapped up the 3-game sweep from Ole Miss by LSU. Tigers going to take on Nichols tomorrow night at the box. They will also square off. Who they got this weekend, Stu? They got Alabama? Is it Bama? Is it
I
Bama
think it
this
is
weekend?
Alabama this weekend, right?
Yeah, I think so.
What about Tennessee, Vandy? Jeez.
A lot of emotion in that game.
I mean, that was wild, right? I mean, that's just like
I didn't see the whole thing.
Embarrassing. Well, I didn't either. I just saw highlights of it, but 17-1.
Ugh.
That's nasty.
Yeah, Alabama in town.
It is Alabama.
Friday, Saturday,
in
Sunday.
town.
Tied.
6 o'clock, 1 o'clock.
What'd you say? Friday, Saturday, and Sunday?
Yep.
Okay.
Gumpers will be in town.
The Gumpers.
They ain't coming from baseball.
You don't think so? Some of them will.
Family.
The ones that are here, that live here, will. There's
Sure.
so many Alabama people that live here. That's wild to me.
Well, Bama is. There's so many more Bama fans that just pop up.
There are. You're right.
Everybody loves a winner. Which, by the way, I watched a little bit of Bama's spring game on Saturday. I will say this: it was Bama's A-Day, so to have as much participation as LSU did in this weekend for their recruiting visit is a sign of good. One of the key members that was there as an underclassman I thought really played well for LSU is Keelan Moses, who we've talked to